Right. Come on then. All right, ma'am. Let's find out then.
The distance between where I started and where I am, I've spent this evening trying to understand what actually made the difference.
There's a garden in Somerset that people drive considerable distance to see. It sits behind a Georgian manor house at the end of a gravel lane off the A361, shielded from the road by a long row of copper beeches that turn, in October, to a color that is approximately the shade of a very good autumn sunset. The garden is famous in horticultural circles for two things: the extraordinary complexity and beauty of its design, and the story of the man who made it. His name was Samuel Arthur Briggs. He was not born into gardens or into knowledge or into any kind of advantage that the world typically associates with this kind of mastery he eventually achieved. He was born in Sunderland in a terraced house 3 streets from the docks, to a woman who worked in a textile mill and a father who left before Samuel was old enough to remember his face. He arrived at the Hartwell estate at the age of 17 with a second-hand canvas bag, a pair of boots that were slightly too large, and no clear idea, beyond the vague conviction that staying in Sunderland would be a kind of slow disappearance of what he intended to do with his life. What he had, as his mother would later tell anyone who asked, was a quality that is almost impossible to teach and nearly impossible to suppress. He listened, he worked, and he cared about the work itself, about doing it correctly, about the people and living things around him. He cared in a particular way that distinguishes the person who will one day be exceptional from the many who will simply go through the motions. This is how a boy who arrived as a garden hand, the lowest rank and position on the estate's outdoor staff, became, over the course of 20 years, the most celebrated landscape architect in the west of England. It is not a story about luck, though luck plays its small, honest part. It is not a story about talent alone, though talent is present. It is, above all, a story about the extraordinary power of obedient service, not the servility of broken spirit, but the obedience of a person who understood that learning from those above you is the fastest road to surpassing them. The morning Samuel Briggs left Sunderland, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind off the North Sea had a particular quality of a disagreement that refuses to resolve itself. He was 17 years old, had left school at 15, and had spent the intervening 2 years working whatever jobs came available: stacking shelves at the cash and carry warehouse, cleaning plates at the roadside cafe, helping a retired plumber named Derek with odd jobs that Derek's back no longer permitted him to do alone. He was not unhappy exactly, but he was aware, in a way that perceptive young people sometimes are aware before they have the vocabulary to fully articulate it, that the life available to him in Sunderland, if he remained, would be assembled from a limited range of components, and that not one of those components corresponded to the feeling he had sometimes when he laid awake at night. A feeling he would describe, if pressed, as a sense that there was something in him that had not yet been asked to do its real work. His mother, Constance Briggs, had heard about the position at Hartwell Estates through a woman she worked alongside at the textile mill, whose sister-in-law had done some seasonal kitchen work in Somerset and had come back with stories of a grand estate that was always looking for outdoor staff. Constance had written a letter carefully in her deliberate, upright handwriting to the address she had been given. 3 weeks later, a reply arrived on heavy cream-colored paper signed by one Reginald Moss, head groundskeeper, stating that if the boy was hardworking, presentable, and willing to learn, he was welcome to present himself at Hartwell Estate on the first Monday of October and they would see how he would get on. The brevity of this invitation was, in its own way, a kind of test. On the night before Samuel's departure, Constance sat down at the kitchen table with him and made him a ham sandwich and a cup of tea, and said everything she had to say in the direct, unhurried way she had of saying things that mattered.
Work hard at whatever they ask you to do. Don't imagine any job is beneath you until you've done it better than anyone else.
Yes, ma'am.
Be honest, especially when honesty is inconvenient. Save something from every wage, I don't care how little. And thank people who help you properly with words.
I will.
The distance between where you're starting and where you can end up, that's not fixed by anything except your own choices. That's the most frightening thing in the world, and the most magnificent.
I know, ma'am.
Good lad.
Samuel listened to all of it without interruption, which was his way. He held his cup of tea in both hands and looked at his mother and absorbed what she said the way good soil absorbed rain, quietly, thoroughly, and with an orientation toward growth. Then he ate his sandwich, went to bed, and in the morning he left.
Cheers, son.
Long journey, love.
Somerset, first time.
Lovely part of the world. You'll like it.
That's the plan.
Samuel arrived at Hartwell Estate on foot, having taken the coach to the village of Hartwell Green and walked the remaining mile and a half along the lane that wounded through farmland and then suddenly, without warning, became beautiful. The copper beeches appeared first, a long double row of them, their canopy interlocking overhead to create a tunnel of amber light. He walked through this tunnel slowly, in spite of himself, because it was the kind of thing that slows a person down, whether they intended to be slowed or not. The house came into view at the end of the beeches. It was a Georgian manor of pale limestone, 3 stories, symmetrical, with tall sash windows and a portico supported by 2 columns that were slightly green with age. It was not ostentatious. It had a particular quality of very old, very well maintained buildings, a kind of dignity that comes from endurance rather than show. Around it, on 3 sides, lay the grounds, lawns, herbaceous borders, and a walled kitchen garden, an orchard, and beyond all of these, what appeared to be the beginning of a much larger planted landscape that stretched towards the low hills in the distance. Samuel stood at the end of the beach tunnel and looked at all of this for a long moment. It was not that he had never seen beautiful things, but he had never before seen a place that seemed so entirely devoted to the cultivation of beauty, as though the whole enterprise of the estate was organized around the conviction that growing things well was a serious, worthy, lifelong occupation. Something shifted in him standing there. He would not have been able to name it precisely, but the first time in his 17 years that he had seen a version of a life and thought that whatever this is, I want to understand it. He adjusted his bag on his shoulder, straightened his jacket, and walked up the gravel drive on the side entrance, as the letter had instructed. Reginald Moss was exactly what he looked like, a man who had spent 30 years in the earth and had, in the process, taken some of the earth's qualities. He was thick-set and deliberate, and gave the impression of something that would not be easily moved by weather or worry. He had large, permanently soiled, darkened hands, and a face that had been weathered by a great many seasons into something that was neither young nor old, but simply and thoroughly permanent. He looked Samuel up and down when the boy appeared at the yard entrance, in the same unhurried way he might assess a new piece of equipment. Not unkindly, but without sentiment. Then he said,
You're the Sunderland lad? Yes, sir. Ever done garden work before? Yards round the back, through the gate. You're the Sunderland lad. Right,
Not formally, sir. I've kept a small allotment with my mother and I've done general labouring.
right.
Mr. Moss set down the spade and picked up a second one which he held out to Samuel. The border along the east lawn needs turning over. Weeds out, compost worked in. 6 inches deep, no shallower. You'll find the compost heap behind the wall there. Wheelbarrow by the shed. I'll come out and check in an hour. He did not ask whether Samuel had questions. He did not explain the purpose of the task, or whether it was a test, or how long the job was expected to take. He simply pointed and turned back to the handle he had been replacing. Samuel, who might have been disconcerted by this, was not. He had been around working people all his life, and he understood instinctively that in environments where real work is done, you demonstrate what you are worth by doing the work, not by discussing it. He took the spade, he found the wheelbarrow, he located the compost heap, and got on with it. An hour later, Reginald Moss came to inspect. He walked the length of the turned border without speaking, pressing his boot occasionally into the loosened earth to check the depth, bending once to examine the foot of weed that had been removed. At the far end of the border, he turned and walked back, looking more closely this time.
Even depth throughout. Clean weed removal, you got the roots, which most people don't bother with. Compost worked in properly, not just left on top. Do the next section.
He walked away. That was all. But Samuel, who had learned to read the language beneath the word, understood that he had passed something. He picked up the spade and moved to the next section. Samuel's first months at Hartwell Estates were, by any standard measure of excitement or adventure, uneventful. He rose at 6 o'clock each morning in a small cottage room he shared with Oliver Cross, ate breakfast in the estate staff kitchen, and reported to the groundskeeper yard by 7. The work varied with the season but maintained a consistent character, physical, methodical, and entirely unambiguous in its requirements. Clear leaves, trim hedges, spread mulch, plant bulbs in the hundreds. Grade swooping drifts off them across the lawn, placed with a precision that Moss dictated and enforced. Repair fence, shift compost, dig. Oliver Cross, his bunkmate, was a genial young man from Devon who had been at Hartwell for 3 years and had reached a comfortable plateau of competence at which he showed no strong inclination to progress. He was not lazy exactly. He did the work, but he did the minimum of it. And he had a tendency to interpret every instruction as though guideline rather than specification. Moss had long since stopped expecting innovation from Oliver. He did not hold this against him. Oliver was reliable, good humored, and had a remarkable aptitude for unclogging the estate's antique drainage system, which was a skill not to be undervalued. Samuel, from the beginning, did something that Oliver found mildly peculiar. He asked questions, not in a manner of someone seeking to avoid work or display knowledge he did not have, but with the focused curiosity of someone determined to understand the system behind the task. Why were the bulbs planted at a specific depth? Why was the hedge trimmed and composted rather than burned? Why was the east border turned in autumn rather than spring? What was the purpose of the particular pruning sequence being applied to the old roses? At first, Moss answered briefly and continued with whatever he was doing, but the questions continued, consistent, intelligent, clearly coming from actual observation rather than idle curiosity. He began to answer more fully, and then gradually, without announcement, he began to explain things before Samuel asked, pointing out decisions, naming plans, identifying the logic. Oliver noticed this evolution and mentioned it one evening as they sat by a small gas heater in the shared room. Oliver with a paperback novel, and Samuel with a library book on soil composition that he had borrowed from Mrs. Hartwell's library with Harriet Bell's quiet facilitation.
You know, Moss never talks that much to anyone. He talked more to you today than he's talked to me in 3 years. What do you do that's different?
I just listen when he talks, and I do what he says exactly, not approximately.
Oliver was quiet for a moment, then returned to his novel. but something in his expression suggested this observation had landed somewhere deeper than it appeared. Winter at Hartwell had a particular quality that Samuel had not anticipated. It was quieter, certainly. The frantic activity of autumn planting was over, and the ground settled into a state of suspended patience that felt, to someone who had grown up in the industrial north, almost meditative. But it was not idle. The winter was, as Reginald Moss explained during a rare extended conversation over a mug of tea in the shed one bitter January morning, when the outdoor work had been halted by a hard frost, the season in which a good gardener does their thinking.
Every decision you make in March is actually made in January. You're planning the succession of the borders. What goes in when, what comes out when, what you need to have ready. You're reading, you're looking at what didn't work and asking yourself why. You're observing what the frost is doing to the soil, what it's doing to the plants that are dormant, what it's doing to the drainage. The garden doesn't stop teaching you just because nothing appears to be happening. It teaches you differently in winter.
Samuel absorbed this. He had been using the quieter weeks to read everything available to him on horticulture, botany, and landscape design. Moss had mentioned in passing that Mrs. Hartwell kept an extensive reference library in the house, several shelves of horticulture and natural history texts, accumulated over 3 generations of family ownership. Harriet Bell, the housekeeper, who had taken a quiet interest in Samuel from his first week, had mentioned this to Mrs. Hartwell, who had, without making a particular occasion of it, simply left word through Harriet that the boy from the grounds was welcome to borrow any book he liked, provided he returned it in the condition he found it. The gift, casual and uncommented upon, as it was, transformed Samuel's winter. He read with the hunger of someone who has discovered relatively late that books contain answers to questions he has been carrying without understanding he was carrying them. He read about the chemistry of soil. He read about the history of English landscape design, from the formal parterres of the 17th century through the revolutionary informality of the 18th century naturalistic movement. Capability, Brown Humphrey Repton, the great tradition of working with the natural character of a landscape rather than against it. He read about plant taxonomy, about the science of propagation, about the history of the kitchen garden as a functional and aesthetic form. And every morning he applied what he had read to what he observed. He walked the grounds with his eyes calibrated differently each week, seen structures and decisions and histories in what had previously seemed like a simply large, well kept garden. One evening in late January, Moss found him on his knees in the wall garden, his bare hands in the frozen soil, examining the root structure of a struggling box hedge.
What are you looking for?
I read about box blight, the fungal thing. I think this section might have it. The root structure isn't right. If it is blight, the whole hedge will need to come out before spring or it will spread to the others.
Moss crouched beside him. He examined the root Samuel was holding. His expression, which habitually gave very little away, changed in a subtle but unmistakable way.
You're right. I was going to address this next month. How did you know what to look for?
I've been studying the old records. I borrowed a book on fungal diseases of ornamental plants, Mrs. Glendon's reference guide, the 7th volume. It had photographs.
Moss looked at him for a moment, then stood. He brushed the soil from his knees and said, with the characteristic brevity that in his vocabulary served as high praise,
Good. Come and see me tomorrow morning before the others. We'll plan the removal together.
Yes, sir.
Samuel was 18 years old. It was the first time in his life that he had been invited to plan rather than execute. He stood in the frozen wall garden for a moment after Moss walked away, and then he smiled to himself, and the cold did not feel as cold. Eleanor Hartwell was 63 years old and had owned and managed Hartwell Estates since the death of her husband Gerald 14 years earlier. She was a tall woman, slim with white hair cut practically short, and an expression of alert intelligence that she wore the way some people wore comfortable clothes, as a default, unself-conscious state. She had a reputation in Somerset for being difficult, which was what certain kind of people said about women who were precise, direct, and unimpressed by social performance. Samuel had seen her twice at a distance in the 4 months at the estate. He had not been introduced to her. Junior outdoor staff were not, as a rule, introduced to the owner of the historic estate in the first winter of their employment. So when Harriet Bell appeared in the groundskeeper yard on a cold February morning and told him that Mrs. Hartwell wanted to speak with him about the wall garden, he experienced a moment of the specific anxiety that accompanies being summoned to a significant meeting for which one has no preparation. He wiped his hands on his work trousers, was reminded by Harriet's expression that this was perhaps insignificant, went and washed them properly, and followed her to the morning room. Eleanor Hartwell looked up from her correspondence when he came in. She examined him for a moment, the same direct, measuring quality she apparently applied to everything, and then said, "Sit down, please. Reginald had shown me your assessment of the box hedge situation. I'd like to hear from you directly." Samuel sat. He was nervous, which was reasonable. He was also, and this surprised him slightly, calm beneath the nervousness. Grounded in what he actually knew, he explained what he had observed, what he had read, what he had diagnosed, and what he recommended, in a clear and careful language. He explained the time and imperative. If the blight section was not removed before the spring growth began, the fungus would spread to the healthy section, and the cost, both financial and aesthetic, would be significantly greater. He had estimated the replacement cost of a full hedge if the blight was allowed to spread, and he mentioned this figure. Mrs. Hartwell listened without interruption. When he finished, she asked several precise questions, all of which suggested she had some existing knowledge of the subject and was testing the depth of his. He answered each one honestly, including answers where "I'm not entirely certain, but my understanding from what I've read was the most accurate response." At the end of this exchange, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said,
How old are you?
18, Mrs. Hartwell.
And you've been here since October. What were you doing before?
Labouring work, mostly, in Sunderland.
Where did you learn to think like this?
Samuel considered the question. "I don't know if I learned it anywhere exactly. When I don't understand why something is happening or why something is done a certain way, I find it hard to rest until I do understand it. So I read, and I ask Reginald, and I try to apply what I learn to what I actually see. I think that's all it is." Mrs. Hartwell held his gaze for a long moment. "That is not all it is," she said finally. "But it is a great deal." She turned back to her correspondence, which was a signal that the meeting had concluded. Then, as he stood to leave, she said without looking up, "You have unrestricted access to the library. Tell Harriet. And Reginald is to include you in the planning discussion for the spring program." Samuel walked back to the groundskeeper yard with a quiet internal sensation of a door opening that he had not previously known was there. Dr. Margaret Fell came to Hartwell Estate every summer for a week, as she had done for the past 8 years. She was a senior lecturer in botany at the University of Bristol, specializing in the history and pharmacology of English medicinal gardens and Hartwell's walled medicinal garden, which had been planted in its current form in 1847 and maintained largely true to its original design, was one of the finest extant example of Victorian era physic garden in private ownership. It was, in her professional view, extraordinary, and she treated every visit as both a research trip and something approaching a pilgrimage. She arrived in July with a canvas bag full of notebooks, a camera on a strap around her neck, and a preoccupied expression of a person whose primary focus is 20 feet ahead of where they are standing. Harriet Bell showed her to her usual guest room, and by mid-morning she was in the medicinal garden, methodically cataloging specimen and making notes in her close precise handwriting. Samuel was working in the adjacent section of the walled garden when she arrived. He had spent the past several weeks paying particular attention to the medicinal garden, having read extensively about it from a Victorian-era gardening journal he had found among the estate's library books. He had noted several plants that appeared mislabeled, and one section of the planting plan that seemed inconsistent with the original Victorian layout documented in the photograph he had found in the estate's archive box. He was not planning to say anything about this. It was not his area of authority, and Dr. Feld was an expert with 8 years of experience with this specific garden. But shortly before noon, she came around the corner of the garden wall looking at her notebook with an expression of moderate frustration and very nearly walked into his wheelbarrow. She looked up, startled. He stepped back. They apologized simultaneously, and then she looked at what he had been doing. Carefully staking a row of elecampane plants, a tall medicinal herb, and said, with the directness of someone for whom social niceties are inefficient.
You know what those are?
Inula helenium. Victorian physicians used the root for respiratory conditions. It was believed to have antibacterial properties. The research is more recent, but there is apparently some genuine scientific basis for the traditional use.
Dr. Feld looked at him with an expression of a person who has just heard something they did not expect.
Where did you learn that?
From Mrs. Hartwell's library mostly. There is an 1863 edition of a botanical pharmacopoeia, the Flukiger and Hanbury. That covers most of the plants in this section in considerable detail. And I found a Victorian gardening. I thought this journal with notes about the original planting plan might interest you. Actually, if you hadn't already seen it.
The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. They sat on a low stone wall of the garden with the journal between them, cross-referencing Samuel's observation about the inconsistencies in the current planting against the historical record. 3 of his observations were correct, 2 were not, and Dr. Feld explained with patient precision why, and Samuel listened with the same attention he brought to everything, and understood. At the end of the 2 hours, Dr. Feld looked at him with an expression that combined assessment with decision in roughly equal measure.
How old are you?
19.
And your formal education?
Left school at 15. I've been studying on my own since then.
Have you ever considered a formal education in botany or landscape science?
I haven't had that. I've thought about it. But the practical side of things seemed more immediately useful.
The practical and the theoretical are not two separate roads, they are the same road. And people who walk both simultaneously cover ground much faster than those who walk only one. I will be in touch, Mr. Briggs. I would like to suggest something to you by the end of the week, if you're willing to hear it.
What Dr. Margaret Feld proposed was this. The University of Bristol ran in conjunction with the Royal Horticultural Society, a part-time distance learning program in horticultural science and landscape studies. It was a 4-year program designed specifically for people working in the horticultural industry who could not attend full-time. Coursework was completed at home, with 3 residential weeks at the university per year, and practical assessment conducted at the student's place of work. Dr. Feld was involved in the academic oversight of the program. She was, in plain terms, offering to put Samuel's name forward and to advocate for his admission on the strength of what she had observed. The cost of the program was real, not catastrophic, but not nothing. Samuel would need to fund it himself, at least partially. He would need Reginald Moss's and Mrs. Hartwell's agreement that his working hours could accommodate the study requirements. And he would need to commit to 4 years of working full-time while studying in whatever time remained. Samuel turned his teacup in his hand and thought about all of this.
Why are you doing this for someone you met 2 days ago?
Because I have been in education for 23 years, and I have seen a great many students who had every credential and very little genuine intellectual hunger. And I have seen occasionally people who had no credential and so much hunger that the absence of the credential was obviously a waste. You are the second kind. The second kind is rarer and, in my experience, more interesting to work with. It would be a professional error not to. Also, your notes on the planting inconsistencies were accurate in 3 out of 5 cases, and the methodology used to identify them was sound. That is a better rate than several of my postgraduate students have achieved in this garden.
I'll need to speak with Reginald and with Mrs. Hartwell.
Of course, I have already mentioned it informally to Mrs. Hartwell. She said, and I am quoting directly, "Tell him not to be an idiot about it." So, what do you think?
All right, yes. I'd like to try.
Of all the conversations Samuel had anticipated about his decision to apply to the program, the one with Reginald Moss felt most consequential. Not because Reginald had the power to prevent it. He did not, ultimately, but because in 2 years of working alongside this man, Samuel had come to regard his opinion with a seriousness he gave to very few people's opinions. Reginald was not a demonstrative person. He was not easy to read, but he was consistently fair, consistently knowledgeable, and consistently honest. And those qualities, Samuel had learned, were worth more than warmth and charm. He explained the program. He explained what it would require in terms of time. He was direct about the fact that there would be periods when he was slower, less present, carrying additional weight of study on top of the work. He did not pretend that this was without impact. Reginald listened. He asked 3 questions, all of them practical. Then he was quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably only 40 seconds. Then he said,
When I was 23, I was offered a place on a similar program through the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. I turned it down because I was comfortable where I was, and I thought comfortable was the same as satisfied. I have never been certain I was right about that.
the silence that followed this admission was of a particular quality of a confidence shared across a significant difference in age and rank, rare, and received by Samuel with the full weight of what it meant.
Do the program. Don't let comfort be the reason you don't. I'll manage the roster. What you learn, you bring back here. That is the arrangement.
Yes, and thank you, Reginald.
Get back to work.
Which in his vocabulary was approximately the same as an embrace. The 4 years of the program were the hardest and most expensive years of Samuel's life. They were hard in the way that things worth doing are hard. Not the grinding, pointless difficulty of work that leads nowhere, but the demanding, purposeful difficulty of work that is permanently widening what you are capable of. They required a discipline of time and energy that had no margin for waste. He was at work by 7, worked through the day, ate quickly at 6, and studied from 7 until 10 or 11 each evening. At weekends, when the estate's requirements permitted, he read and wrote and worked through the program's assignments with the focused, unhurried intensity that had characterized his approach to everything since childhood. The 3 residential weeks per year at the University of Bristol were revelatory in a way he had not quite anticipated. He had expected the academic content, and that was rich and useful and built on his independent reading in ways that gave everything new structure and depth. What he had not expected was the discovery that he was not unusual, that there were, in those seminar rooms, people from every conceivable background and starting point who had arrived at the same hunger for understanding through entirely different roads. There was a woman in her 40s who had spent 20 years as a florist and had decided she wanted to understand at the scientific level why flowers behaved as they did. There was a retired engineer who had been growing vegetables since his 50s and wanted to understand the ecology he had been observing for decades. There was a young man from Cornwall who had never seen a university before and who sat Samuel with the particular attentiveness of someone for whom none of this can be taken for granted. In these rooms, Samuel contributed. He did not overstate what he knew, and he did not understate it either. When his observations from Hartwell were relevant, he shared them. When other people's experience illuminated something he had not considered, he acknowledged it. He asked questions that were genuine rather than performative. He developed, over these 12 residential weeks across 4 years, a network of colleagues and friendships that would matter later in ways he could not have predicted. He also received, for the first time, formal recognition for what he was capable of. His assessments were consistently among the highest in his cohort. Dr. Feld, who was his academic supervisor for the program's practical component, was careful not to show favoritism, but she was not in the habit of hiding accurate assessments, and her handwritten feedback on his work was, year on year, a record of genuine intellectual development that she had found genuinely interesting to document. Back at Hartwell, the work continued. He and Reginald had developed by the third year something that was no longer simply a senior junior working relationship, but a genuine professional collaboration. Reginald would present a decision about planting, drainage, the management of a particular section, and Samuel would engage with it at the level of analysis that his study was equipping him for. Reginald sometimes adjusted his approach based on what Samuel brought. Sometimes he held his position and explained why, and Samuel adjusted his understanding. Both kinds of exchange were valuable. Oliver Cross, watching this evolution from his comfortable plateau, was neither resentful nor particularly galvanized. He congratulated Samuel genuinely on each year's progress and showed no inclination to follow the same road. They remained friends, the comfortable, undemanding friendship of two people who respect each other's choices, which is one of the more durable kinds. Wearing the kind of wax jacket that is chosen for appearance rather than utility, accompanied by a junior colleague who carried his portfolio and said very little. He was 45, professionally successful, and had the smooth assurance of a man who had been told many times that he was the most suitable person in the room. He was, in purely technical terms, accomplished. Samuel had researched him before the visit. 3 completed landscape projects of note, 2 awards from the Landscape Institute, a client list that included 3 National Trust properties. He knew his field. But he had the manner of someone who had stopped being curious for some years ago and was operating comfortably on the capital of past learning. And Samuel, whose curiosity was running at full throttle, found this slightly dispiriting. The commission was for the redesign of the South Grounds, a 12-acre section that currently comprised of an aging Victorian shrubbery, 2 ponds in need of significant work, and a long slope down the estate boundary that had never been developed with any strong design intention. Mrs. Hartwell had commissioned Whitmore after receiving his proposal, which had been professional and polished. Samuel and Reginald had been included in the initial site meeting as estate representatives. The meeting was professional and polite. Whitmore was not rude to Samuel or Reginald. He was simply oriented towards Mrs. Hartwell as the only person whose input he considered fully relevant. He presented his initial concept with confidence and fluency, a formal interpretation of the Victorian character, reinstating what he described as the original language of the estate. Samuel listened to the entire presentation, then said, carefully, without confrontation,
The new irrigation system will maximize the land's potential. I wonder if I might ask about the drainage assessment for the lower slope. What about it? The lower section of the south grounds has a clay substrate that creates significant waterlogging in the winter months. The Victorian shrubbery that's currently there has managed this in part because the root systems of the established shrubs act as a kind of natural drainage sponge. If we remove the shrubbery and replace it with a more formal planting scheme, we'll be removing that drainage function. Before the redesign is finalized, I'd want to be certain there's a drainage infrastructure plan that compensates for this, otherwise the new planting will be sitting in standing water by November.
The room was quiet. Whitmore looked at him, the first time he had really looked at him, with an expression that cycled quickly through surprise, reassessment, and private irritation that he managed to keep largely beneath the surface.
That's a valid point. We'll include it in the survey.
Thank you, Samuel. Reginald, anything to add?
Reginald Moss said nothing, but his expression, which gave very little away, gave, in this particular moment, the impression of a man who was pleased. Reginald Moss was not a man who arrived anywhere without purpose, and Samuel had learned to receive his evening appearances in the shed as the beginning of a conversation that would be worth having. He set aside his notebook as the older man settled onto a low stool by the workbench and accepted a mug of tea that Samuel poured without being asked.
Whitmore has submitted his revised proposal. He's incorporated a drainage infrastructure plan for the lower slope Mrs. Hartwell showed me. It's a good plan. Professionally done. He also asked who had flagged the drainage issue. She told him it was you. He asked what your qualifications were.
What did she say?
She said you were a ground hand who had been studying on his own initiative for several years and had apparently developed a better practical knowledge of this estate's soil and water conditions than most professionals twice his age. She may have phrased it somewhat more forcefully than that.
I'm nearly through the program. Another 18 months, I'll have the qualification properly then.
I know. That's not what I came to say. I'm going to be retiring in 2 years. I've told Mrs. Hartwell she's going to new head groundskeeper.
The weight of this settled in the shed between them. The gaslight hissed softly. Outside, somewhere in the grounds, a tawny owl called once and was silent.
You could recommend someone with 30 years of experience.
I could. The person I'm recommending has the equivalent of 30 years of experience in the 6 years he's been here. Because of how he's used them, experience is not time. It is time multiplied by attention. You have more of that product than most people I've known. Finish your program. Do it well. Be ready in 2 years. That's all.
He went. The owl called again, twice this time, and then the night was quiet. The completion ceremony for the HNC in Horticultural Science and Landscape Studies was held in a lecture hall that was large enough to be formal without being grand. The graduating cohort of Samuel's year numbered 27, ranging in age from 22 to 58. They sat in a crescent, facing a small platform where 3 faculty members, including Dr. Feld, presenting certificates, and in cases where it was warranted, the special commendations. Samuel had written his final dissertation on the restoration of the Victorian medicinal garden at Hartwell Estate. Its history, its current condition, the inconsistencies he and Dr. Feld had identified across their 5 years of collaboration, and their proposed restoration plan, grounded in both historical accuracy and modern horticultural science. It had been, according to Dr. Feld's assessment, the strongest piece of work the program had received in its 11-year history. She said this in writing the formal assessment record, and she said it again in person when she presented him his certificate. She also said more quietly as she shook his hand,
I have written to the University of Bristol's School of Geographical Sciences on your behalf. There is a taught master's program in landscape architecture and environmental design that accepts practitioner applicants with exceptional portfolios in lieu of a first degree. I have submitted your dissertation and your practical portfolio as supporting material. You will receive a letter within the month.
Dr. Field.
Do not thank me. The work is entirely yours. I have merely pointed a torch at what was already there. Now go and telephone your mother.
He did. He stood outside the university on a warm July afternoon, with his certificate rolled under one arm and the Bristol skyline in front of him, and telephoned his mother in Sunderland. She answered on the 3rd ring. He told her. There was a silence on the line. Then Constance Briggs said, in a voice that contained in roughly equal measure pride and the particular emotion that has no clean name, but is something between relief and vindication. Well done, son. Well done. He pressed the phone against his ear and held it there for a moment, and looked at the Bristol skyline and thought of copper beech trees in October light. Reginald Moss's retirement was marked in a way he would have chosen, which is to say, with minimum ceremony, good sandwiches, and the kind of conversation between people who had worked alongside each other that doesn't need to be decorated. He had worked at Hartwell for 31 years. He had known 3 generations of the Hartwell family. He had planted things that were now mature and permanent, and would outlive everyone present at the gathering. He shook Samuel's hand at the end of the afternoon, the handshake of a man handing over something real and significant. He did not make a speech. He said, "You know the ground. You know the plants. You know what the estate needs. Trust what you know." Then he picked up a single box of personal items he had cleared from the shed. A seed catalog, a worn volume of RHS encyclopedia, a photograph, and walked to the car that was taking him to his sister's house in Dorset. Samuel watched him go. Harriet Bell appeared at his elbow with a glass of wine that he didn't ask for, and a look that suggested she thought he might need it.
He was proud of you. He never said it, obviously. But he was.
I know.
Good. That's the important thing. Now stop standing here looking sentimental and go and be the head groundskeeper. There's a problem with the irrigation on the west border that needs sorting before Tuesday.
Which section?
The bit that's flooding.
Samuel laughed, genuine, warm, and went. The transition from junior to senior carries, for people of genuine character, a set of challenges that the transition itself does not warn you about. The challenges of a junior work are external. The work is hard, the hours are long, the authority belongs to others. The challenge of a senior work are internal. The authority belongs to you, which means the errors belong to you, and the management of other people's energies and frustrations and ambitions belongs to you. Samuel had thought about this. He had watched Reginald manage it for 6 years, and he had drawn his own conclusions about what worked and what didn't. He had decided, before taking the role formally, on a set of principles that he would attempt to apply, not as rigid rules, but as defaults from which he would deviate only for clear and considered reasons. The first, he would explain the reason behind every instruction he gave, not because he needed to justify himself, but because he had experienced, as a junior, the difference between doing a task you understand and doing a task you were told to do without understanding, and the first produced consistently better work. People work better when they know why. The second, he would acknowledge his own uncertainty when it was present. He was 24. His team included a man who was 52 and had been doing this for 25 years. There were things that man knew from experience that Samuel did not. Samuel intended to make use of that knowledge, which required him acknowledging it rather than performing a confidence he did not always have. The third, the estate's plans, grounds, and long-term health were the measure of everything. Not how impressive the work looked in the short term, not what visitors said, not what was easiest or most convenient. The long-term health of the living landscape was the standard, and every decision was evaluated against it. These principles did not make the year without difficulty. There were conflicts, miscommunications, a significant error in the replanting of the rose garden that cost several weeks and considerable money to correct, an error that Samuel had made in trusting a supplier's representation about the disease resistance of a cultivar without independently verifying it. He did not hide his mistake. He acknowledged it to Mrs. Hartwell in full, explained what had happened, took responsibility explicitly, and outlined what he was doing to correct it and what he would do differently to prevent a recurrence. She listened, asked 2 questions, and said, "Sort it out then." He sorted it out, and he never made the same class of error again. The master's program in landscape architecture and environmental design was the most intellectually demanding thing Samuel had ever attempted, and he had never been more grateful for any difficulty in his life. It operated at a level of analytical rigor that required him to be simultaneously more precise and more expansive in his thinking, more precise in the technical and ecological dimension, more expansive in the design and conceptual dimension, where solutions were not right or wrong, but better or less good. And the distinction required the development of a kind of judgment that was part of knowledge, part experience, and part a quality that was its clean definition, but corresponds roughly to what is sometimes called taste. His dissertation was on the ecological restoration of historic design landscapes, specifically how the design intentions of 18th and 19th century landscape architects could be reinterpreted through the 21st century ecological lens, preventing the aesthetic and historical character of landscape while significantly improving its function as a wildlife habitat and carbon sink. He used Hartwell as his primary case study. The research required him to understand the estate at a level of depth that he was not certain, even after 8 years, that he fully possessed. And the process of researching for that depth changed both his understanding of the estate and his capacity to think about landscape design at every scale. Dr. Feld, who remained his informal academic mentor throughout the program, told him after reading the draft of his dissertation,
This is the kind of work that gets published. I am going to suggest it to the Journal of Landscape Ecology. That is not a suggestion you need to act on immediately, but it is something you should know is possible.
All right. Thank you.
Thank yourself. I had nothing to do with the work.
James Whitmore's return to Hartwell was professional in its occasion and more complicated in its texture. 2 years had passed since the initial meeting where Samuel had raised the drainage issue. In those 2 years, the South Grounds project had proceeded, incorporating Whitmore's design with the drainage infrastructure that Samuel's observation had necessitated. And the results, now visible in the first phase of planting, were genuinely fine. The lower slopes, properly drained, had taken its new planting beautifully. The ponds restored were clear and well margined. The Victorian shrubbery had been sensitively removed and replaced with a planting scheme that maintained the estate's historical character while introducing a more layered ecological richness. Whitmore walked the completed sections with Samuel and Reginald's successor as the side point of contact. Making notes, taking photographs, he was professional, thorough, and noticeably more attentive to Samuel than he had been in the first meeting. He asked detailed questions about planting choices, the soil management during construction, the establishment care program for the new plants. Samuel answered all of them clearly and precisely. At the end of the assessment walk, Whitmore paused on the upper terrace with a view of the lower slope below them and said, with a directness that seemed for him effortful,
The work here is exceptional, better than what I usually see in an estate of this size. You've gone significantly beyond the design brief in terms of ecological integration. I hadn't specified the wildflower seeding in the margin strips, for instance, or the log stack habitats by the ponds. The brief was for aesthetic restoration. I added the ecological elements because the design gives them scope and the estate benefits from the biodiversity. It means the management of the surrounding planted areas is actually easier over time because the natural pest regulation improves. I should have cleared it with you. I apologize for not doing so.
No, you were right to make those calls. They improved the design.
There was a pause. Then Whitmore said something that was clearly not easy for him to say, and which he said anyway, which elevated him considerably in Samuel's estimation. I misjudged you when we first met. I made assumptions about your capacity on a basis of your title. That was a professional error. I want to acknowledge it. Samuel looked at the lower slope, with its new planting settling into the carefully managed earth, and thought of a 17-year-old boy turning over a border alone in October, with no audience and no promise of anything beyond work itself.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
I'm working on a significant new commission, 160 acres of mixed historic landscape and arable land near Bath. I would like to discuss the possibility of you being involved as a landscape consultant, if you're interested.
I'd be interested, yes.
The project near Bath was the first of what became, over the following 4 years, a growing portfolio of landscape consultancy work. Samuel maintained his position at Hartwell, which remained his home base, his primary responsibility, and the testing ground for everything he was developing, while taking on an increasing number of external commissions. First, through introductions from Whitmore, then through recommendations of clients, then through the publication of his dissertation in the Journal of Landscape Ecology, which brought him a kind of professional visibility he had not anticipated. He employed, in his third year of consulting, an assistant, a young woman named Rosa, fresh from a landscape architecture degree at the University of Edinburgh, who arrived with excellent credentials and the immediately apparent quality of paying complete attention to everything around her. He recognized in her, with a clarity that made him briefly smile, something familiar. He interviewed her for 20 minutes, asked her to walk the Hartwell South grounds with him and tell him what she observed, and offered her a position before they returned to the house. She was, over the following years, outstanding. Samuel was aware, in the way that people of reflective character are aware of the patterns in their lives. that he was now on the other side of the relationship that had defined his early years. The relationship between the junior who is willing to learn and the senior who is willing to teach. He tried to be for Rosa and for the other young people he employed what Reginald Moss had been for him: demanding, fair, and honestly invested in the growth of the people rather than merely in the service they provided. He did not always succeed. Authority and mentorship are practices, not destinations, and there were weeks when the pressure of the work made him less patient, less explanatory, less generous than he intended to be. When this happened, he acknowledged it, not with excessive self-criticism, but with the same plain honesty he had always applied to his errors, and adjusted. The commission came through a trust that managed a substantial historic estate in Wiltshire, 500 acres of mixed woodland, farmland, floral gardens, and derelict Victorian glass houses that had once been among the finest private horticultural complexes in the country. The trust, newly established to restore and open the property to the public, was looking for a landscape architect who could lead the design and restoration of the entire outdoor estate. It was, by any measure, the largest and most significant commission Samuel had ever received. The competing practices include two of the most established landscape architecture firms in England. James Whitmore's practice was among them. Samuel submitted a proposal that was, from the first page, different in its approach from anything else the trust had received. It began not with a design concept, but with a series of questions about the estate's ecological history, its soil types, its water systems, and pre-Victorian character. Questions that the trust committee found, as one member later told him, disorienting at first because we were expecting someone to tell us what they would do. You were asking what the land needed. The presentation of his proposal took 2 hours. He presented it with a combination of technical precision and a genuine passion that had characterized his approach to the subject since the day he had stood at the end of the Copper Beach Tunnel at 17 and felt something in him recognize its work. He knew the material completely. He had visited the Wilshire estate 4 times before submitting the proposal. He had walked every section of it in every weather condition he could manage. He had the soil analyzed. He had commissioned an ecologist's report. He had studied the Victorian records in the country archives. He was awarded the commission 3 weeks after the presentation. He went that evening and stood in the walled medicinal garden at Hartwell, the garden where he had first talked properly with Dr. Feld 15 years ago, and stood in it for a long time in the late evening light. The elk campaign was in flower. The lavender was drowsy with bees. The stone walls held the warmth of the day in them, releasing it slowly into the cooling air. He thought about everyone who had handed him something along the way. His mother, who had handed him the instruction to be better than his starting point. Reginald, who handed him the quality of patient, precise attention to living things. Mrs. Hartwell, who handed him a library and a seat at the planning table. Dr. Fell, who handed him a formal framework for the knowledge he had been assembling without one. James Whitmore, who had handed him a collaboration and, eventually, a respect he had earned entirely on his own terms. He thought about the 17-year-old boy with a second-hand bag and the slightly too large boots. He thought, all right, let's begin. Eleanor Hartwell had been in declining health for the past 2 years, and those who knew her well could see in the steady thinning of her frame and the slightly slowing of her movement the approach of something that she herself was facing with the same precise, uncomplacent directness she had brought to everything else. She had made her arrangements. She had updated her will. She had met with her solicitors and estate managers. And, one cold evening in December, she had asked Harriet Bell to bring Samuel to her sitting room. He came. She was in the wing armchair by the fire, a rug over her knees, a book open on the table beside her that she was clearly not reading. She looked at him when he came in, that direct, measuring look that had not dimmed with age, and said,
Sit down, don't be reverent about it, sit down properly. 17 years ago, a boy arrived at my yard with a bag that was visibly secondhand and boots that didn't fit, and turned over a flower border with more care than most adults bring to work they've been doing for 20 years. I thought then that he was either very simple or very serious, and I hoped he was the second. He was.
Samuel said nothing. He had learned long ago when she wanted a response and when she was talking to the fire as much as one person in the room.
I have been thinking about the estate. I am going to leave it to a charitable trust. It's the right thing. A property like this should be accessible to people. But there is a condition in my will. I want you to remain as the head of the landscape program, not just as head groundskeeper, but as the estate's landscape director. I want your design principles embedded in the trust's governing documents. The things you've built here should last, not because they are yours, but because they are right. Is that something you'll commit to?
Samuel looked at the fire and then at her, the woman who had given him a library and a seat at the table, and the kind of undemonstrative principled support that is rarer and more valuable than dramatic gestures.
Yes, of course. It would be the honor of my professional life.
Good. Don't make it sentimental. That's not what I'm after. Make it excellent. That's all I ever wanted from this place. That's all I ever wanted from anyone. You can go. The irrigation report for the North Garden is on Harriet's desk. Review it before Thursday. There are decisions to be made.
Mrs. Hartwell, thank you for everything from the beginning. I know that's sentimental. I'm saying it anyway.
She held his gaze. Something moved in her expression. Not quite a smile, but something in the family of one.
You earned it. Every last bit of it was yours.
He went, and outside in the dark December grounds, his grounds now, in every practical sense, the landscape he had tended and shaped and studied for 17 years. The frost was coming down, and the estate was still, and somewhere in the bare branches of the walnut tree, an owl was beginning its evening call. The Hartwell estate in October, when Samuel was 49 years old, looked very much as it had when he was 17, in many ways that mattered. The copper beeches at the end of the lane turned the same color they had always turned in autumn, which was approximately the color of a very good sunset. The walled garden was maintained with the same care, the medicinal garden with the same historical fidelity that he and Dr. Feld had worked towards across 2 decades of collaboration. The south grounds, now 15 years settled, had grown into the design landscape Whitmore had imagined and Samuel had built. With the ecological layering that Samuel had added, and that had, as he predicted, made the whole system more beautiful and more resilient over time. The estate now received 12,000 visitors a year, managed by the charitable trust with educational programs for school groups and an annual horticultural conference that had become, in the past 5 years, one of the most respected in the southwest of England. Samuel gave a lecture at each conference, not about himself and not about Hartwell in isolation, but about the principles of landscape stewardship and ecological design that he had been developing and testing throughout his professional life. The lectures were consistently among the conference's most attended and most discussed. Rosa, who is now 36 and running her own thriving practice from Bristol, came back to Hartwell periodically in the way that former apprentices come back to the place that shaped them. She had, over the years, recommended 3 of her own most capable young employees to Hartwell Apprenticeship Program, a program that Samuel had established in his 5th year as landscape director, specifically for young people without formal qualifications who demonstrated the combination of attentiveness, application, and care that he had once demonstrated in a different groundskeeper yard. Oliver Cross, retired now from estate work and living comfortably in Devon, visited once a year and claimed repeatedly that Samuel had always been like this. Nobody disputed it. Every year, on the first Monday of October, the anniversary of his arrival at Hartwell, Samuel sat down and wrote a letter to Sunderland. In the early years, when his mother was alive, he wrote to her. After her death, He wrote to his eldest sister Margaret, who had stayed in Sunderland and raised her family there, and who was, in the family's collective opinion, its most reliable keeper of the flame. The letters were not long or literary. They were honest account of what the year had contained, what he had learned, what he found difficult, and what he was grateful for. On this particular October evening, the letter was longer than usual. He found himself writing about the 17-year-old who had walked up the beach tunnel with a second-hand bag. Not sentimentally, but analytically, as he tended to approach things. He was trying to understand what had made the difference, what had enabled one particular young man, starting with as little as many young people start with, to end up where he was. He wrote for a long time. He wrote about his mother's instruction to be better than his starting point, and about the quality of attention that Reginald had modeled, and about the library that Mrs. Hartwell had opened without ceremony. He wrote about the value of doing every task completely, even when incomplete would have passed unnoticed. He wrote about the importance of asking questions from genuine curiosity rather than performance, and about what it had meant to have people invest in him at moments when he had not yet made a case for investment. And then, near the bottom of the page, he wrote something that surprised him in its plainness and its completeness. I think what made the difference was this. I decided very early, perhaps before I had the words for it, that being asked to do something well was not an insult. That service, honest, careful, complete service, was not diminishment. That the person who sweeps the floor attentively is not less than the person who designs the building. They're both necessary, and both carry dignity. And the one who does their job with full attention to quality, whoever they are, whatever the job, is living as close to the real purpose of life as I know how to identify.
The distance between where I started and where I am, I've spent this evening trying to understand what actually made the difference. I think it was this. I decided early, perhaps before I had the words for it, that being asked to do something well was not an insult. That service, honest, careful, complete service, was not diminishment. The person who sweeps the floor attentively is not less than the person who designs the building. They are both necessary. Both carry dignity. The one who does their job with full attention to quality, whoever they are, whatever the job, is living as close to the real purpose of a life as I know how to identify. I learned it from you first, ma'am, and then from Reginald, and then from a garden that didn't care who I was, only whether I was paying attention.
He sealed the letter, addressed it to his sister Margaret, and set it with the Morning Post. Then he put on his jacket and went out in the October dark to walk the grounds. And just like that, one journey ends, but another one begins. Because greatness doesn't come from where you start, it comes from how seriously you take every step. So tell me, what's one lesson you're taking from this story? Drop it in the comments. And if this inspired you, subscribe because this channel is where stories turn into real life transformation.